Greek proverb, I am because we are, is the foundation of the ACBN YouTube channel. Tap in for all of our remarkable content and ecosystem mobilization through the phenomenal practitioners and thought leaders we engage on this channel. In the words of Adrienne Marie Brown, things are not getting worse, they are getting uncovered. We must hold each other tight to pull back the veil. Get ready for another amazing ACBN powered interview. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much and welcome to our talk for this afternoon. My name is Amoy Henry. Before I do any introductions, I want to go ahead and begin with an ancestral acknowledgement. So we want to begin this session by acknowledging the original stewards of the various lands we are on. We also acknowledge our ancestors. We acknowledge all those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We acknowledge all the elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. With that being said, my name is Amoy Henry. I'm a business strategist, investor, and author. I'm very, very much passionate about the world of technology, investing, and scaling the Black community. Today, joining me is a very good friend of mine, Mr. Dwayne Matthews. I'll let him actually introduce himself, but just wanted to everyone to know this is a safe space. You're all welcome here, and we're interested in the dialogue and having everyone's input. So feel free to use the chat box if you have anything that you'd like to share, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask. No question is too bold or too meek. Feel free. Dwayne, with that said, take it over.
Thank you very much for that brief introduction. I've known Amoy for a bit, and she's extremely impressive. She goes from 0 to 100 very, very quickly, and has a lot of people even more senior than myself that are extremely impressed with all that she's done and all that she continues to do. My name is Dwayne Matthews. A little bit about me. I spent a little bit of time as a teacher. I taught grades 3, 4, 5, 6, a little bit of library. I started a company in open innovation, which is a company that looks for innovation on behalf of larger companies, Fortune 500 companies. So we looked for everything from human beings to patents to technology. And the focus was really looking at any kind of technology that would disrupt society because it had a disruptive, innovative model or potential for disruptive, innovative models. I exited that company many years ago, and I failed at my company after that and got into education and the connection point between the future of education and the future of work. So I spend a bunch of my time there. I consult on behalf of a large virtual school. I also consult with heads of state, directors of education, superintendents, CEOs at companies all around education and the future of work. And from there, I guess I'll hop off my soapbox and hand it back over to Amoy.
Thank you. Yes, this is a person that's been recognized by the United Nations. He was just on, CTV, CDC. He's a global leader, really, and a gem in our city. So if you're not following him already, please feel free to jump over quickly as soon as this talk is finished and follow and support his movement, because he's talking about things that we're sometimes excluded from these conversations. And I find that people like Dwayne are really pushing the needle forward, trying to bring this intelligence to our communities in a very transformative and palatable way. So with that being said, I want to start off with our first kind of question. And, really leaning into this idea of AI, artificial intelligence. What does that mean in layman terms, Dwayne, just to start things off? What does that mean, and how does that kind of interface with the Black community of listeners that we have today?
Right. So, when we talk about artificial intelligence, sometimes the words, they're I don't want to say that they're deceptive, but sometimes the way that the words are put together are not necessarily indicative of what it is. So artificial, yes. Intelligence, when people think of intelligence, they really think of consciousness, and a sense of feeling present. And so this is not that. What it is that it uses a large language model, which means that it takes a massive amount of information all over the web, and it applies probabilities to figure out what is the next string of words that should come out. And what we've learned is that that makes a very human-like conversation and very human-like responses, but the programs themselves are not self-aware. And so it creates a lot of opportunities and a lot of risks. And so, we really have to look at what are the risks and what are the opportunities.
Thank you so much for that, Dwayne. So diving in right away, I guess, how can small business CEOs, leaders, executive directors mitigate risks and maximize opportunities as we, confront this AI new normal? There's a lot of trepidation, there's a lot of anxiety. What are some things that, small business owners can kind of think about in terms of this new normal?
So I think there's a couple things to consider to create some context. And the first thing that I would consider is really to think about what's out in front of us, right? So we typically have systems out in front of us, and those systems are designed with specific outcomes. They're institutional, they're structural, they create interpersonal dynamics between people and an internalized sense of identity as to where we fit into that system. And so in those big systems, we have, sort of big gatekeepers that emerge because the system was designed for them, or they've created some kind of a benefit or privilege that allows that system to work for them. But every now and then, we have these moments where innovation comes up and it disrupts the gatekeeper. So one of the things that I've heard in the last little bit is they said, there's going to be job losses because of AI, chat GPT in specific. The last estimate that I saw was 14 million job losses. And so these are job losses typically for people in all different industries. But in terms of a small business owner may look and think, what are some of the things that I could not do in the past and I can do now? So there might have been people that you needed to hire that you could not afford in the past, right? But now you can. There were things that you couldn't do. Perhaps you needed to pump out massive amounts of websites. You needed to have a big website. Recently I was looking at a website and not just a landing page with the back end and everything. And the person said, that'll be about $30,000 to $40,000. Today, I could probably find a chat GPT program or a company that uses chat GPT, probably somewhere around $15, $20 a month, that would be able to build something like that for me in a matter of hours, as opposed to months. And it would be significantly cheaper, at least on the front end. So I think really what CEOs want to think about is, if I had a genie's lamp and I had superpowers, what are some of the things that I really want to do that I can't afford to do, that I don't have enough money to do? And can I find AI to support that? Can I find large language models that can support that? I gave an example about the website. There's a great website company called Durable, $15 a month. Look them up, durable.ai. But they're able to build not a landing page, a complete website with SEO and back and e-commerce and everything for $15 a month with a handful of prompts. You could probably get that done in the next 24 hours, which is that's astronomical. There are processes that people have that may be in their head, that are not written down, are not properly well documented. A lot of those processes you can now put into certain AI platforms, and now you can train people at scale. You essentially can have your own personal assistant that operates on your specific business, that's been trained to your specific business in your specific industry. So there are lots of opportunities where smaller businesses can act like much larger companies, leveraging the platforms, but they have to be very, very specific and not get too lost in the general, trying to boil the ocean. It has to be, how can I use this model for my particular industry to give me an advantage over companies that are larger than me?
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. So we heard a lot about opportunities there, and this idea of virtual assistant, having sort of like a vehicle that double checks things for you, protects you against like minor issues, or not protects, but helps mitigate things like that. Something that's, curious to me, like a curious idea that I had while you were speaking is, sort of how can we, what are some of the implications of it, right? So the opportunities are clear, but what are some of the implications for AI and the future of work, right? We're seeing the tech industry go through massive layoffs right now, and people are losing jobs left, right, and center in the industry that we thought really was beckoning the future, right? So what are the implications of AI for the future of work, and how can we prepare individuals and organizations for these changes?
So great question, great observation. So one of the things I always think too, it's important to put a bit of context. So a lot of the layoffs in the tech industry, if you look to 2020, you will see that there was a massive amount of hiring. And that massive amount of hiring in 2020, there were specific drivers. In 2020, we didn't really know where the pandemic was going. We knew that everything was going to go online, at least for the immediate future. And so what companies did was that they just hired massive amounts of people because they wanted to make sure they had all the brain trust with them. So people were literally hiring people from other people. Salaries were going way up. So it was a massive boom. When you look at the numbers in terms of the layoffs, most companies still have not laid off as many people as they hired in 2020. What they did was they hired too many people. And so now you're starting to see, almost even numbers, 10,000 here, 10,000 there, because people understood that they hire too many. I mean, are there implications with inflation and all those kinds of things? I'm sure that they are, and some of those things are probably above my pay grade. I have some thoughts about it, but nothing that I would give any advice on. But I think so. That's the first piece. The second, in terms of implications, they're very real implications. And many of them are negative, and many of them are positive. Some of the negative ones. A lot of the models are trained specifically on information that's on the web. And a lot of information on the web is false. There's a lot of misinformation on the web. There's a lot of racism, sexism on the web. There are a lot of people that have access. We have 5 billion internet users. So we have 5 billion media companies with no regulation, all sort of pumping out all kinds of information. And so these language models, at least ChatGPT, is pulling information from the entire web. So you're going to get gems and you're going to get junk all sort of wrapped into that. And that has real implications. The other implications, people are concerned about is misinformation. And, I always believe that context is important when we look at these things. Misinformation is not a new problem. Misinformation has been a problem from, if we go back to the printing press, the Gutenberg printing press, probably about 600 years ago. We know that they were, printing books in China probably about 500 years previously. But if we just go from the Western example of the Gutenberg printing press, we know that once people started printing books about 150 years after, and people start to learn to read, they realize, hey, what's in this book was a lot different than what the priest might have told me, was a lot different than what my religious leader might have told me. And so we have this reformation at that point. And we take that technology, and it took us a few hundred years, but we took that technology, the printed book, and we put it into a strategy to mitigate the risk. And that strategy is called school, right? So school feels very normal, but 150 years ago, most people couldn't read. And we took all of the people and we said, this technology is so important that we're going to pull people off of the farm and we're going to get as many people as possible into the strategy called school. And over the next 100 years, we probably have about a 90% literacy rate and the transformation of economy. So what we're looking at is a complete transformation of economy based on all of these different technologies coming together, and AI being that inflection point in November. It sort of shocked a lot of people into thinking, oh my gosh, a lot of the jobs that we have are going to be gone, and they're going to create new opportunities for economic realities, and we don't know what that looks like. When people were farming, when the vast majority of people were farming, people thought, what would we do when we take all these kids off of the farm? We're probably going to run out of food. We've actually gone in the other direction, where we have way too much food, but we have a terrible distribution problem. So most of us are no longer thinking about where to get our food. Most of us are starting to think about, at least in developed worlds, how do we make sure that we don't eat too much food? So we really do have this interesting transformation where the risks are always the same. We have risks of misinformation. We have risk of transformation that leads to a significant amount of turmoil. And then we have this opportunity piece as well.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And I actually didn't know the history of the schooling and education system and how it was sort of interconnected with the Industrial Revolution in a sense, right? But it does make sense, supply, demand, all of those things. So me, I care about money. I talk about money and finances all the time. I'm interested in securing the bag, especially when it comes to our Black community. So how do we benefit as Black people? How do we secure the bag? What powers ChatGPT, and what are the business, investment, and employment opportunities that we should be mindful of?
So one of the things that I find is when we have moments like this, right? And I won't get too much into disruptive theory. Disruptive theory was made popular by a gentleman that died at the beginning of the pandemic. His name was Clayton Christensen. He was a professor at Harvard University, and he's wrote a couple of books about it, but he's put out a lot of videos online before he passed. Look it up. Some of them are long, some of them are short, but disruptive theory, disruptive innovation. Clayton Christensen, look him up. But one of the interesting things about when we have disruption is that it disrupts the gatekeeper, right? It disrupts the gatekeeper. So when you think about a system, you think systems have gatekeepers. The gatekeepers control the movement, maybe of information. They control the movement of energy. They control the movement of position. When we have disruptive moments, there's this weird time where it's very, very difficult for gatekeepers to know what's happening, or they would typically be called the incumbent by Clayton Christensen. And so the incumbent typically tries to do two things. The incumbent in any sort of system tries to A, delay the transformation, or B, substitute the transformation. So something that they're doing today, they say, you know what, we can remove what we're doing today, and we can just use this new tool to do it just an incremental bit different. The opportunity, however, is it's sort of like a Wizard of the Oz moment, where they don't necessarily understand fully what is possible. And so they create lots of opportunities to try and figure it out. And there's lots of opportunities for new models. So in terms of securing the bag itself, if you wanted to go just to, jobs, there's a company called Resume Builder. They did a survey of about 1,200 companies. They said 90% of those companies are hiring people with ChatGPT experience. Consider that ChatGPT really hit the world at an inflection point, November 2022.
Right.
That means that there's a very few people, if you have only used ChatGPT 10 times, there are very few people in the world that have more experience than you at using ChatGPT. Now get this, out of the 90% that we're hiring, 17% said if the company was over 1,000 people, they said that the starting salaries would be $300,000 a year. 17% of companies interviewed over 1,000 people said that the starting salary in a field that just took off in November said that they're willing to pay $300,000 a year, starting salary. 29% said that they're willing to pay $200,000 a year, starting salary. That means when we get off this podcast, you can open up the ChatGPT and you can start to get super curious about how would I use this? How could I make processes more efficient for someone? How could I transform someone's business? How could I do something that if I wanted to do it, it might have taken me 10 people to hire, but now me by myself can do it. You can start to literally play around with this. And in 3 weeks' time, start thinking about, okay, what jobs do I want to go do? If you're a developer and you're using ChatGPT or GPT-4 to help you code faster, those jobs are open to you today, right? If you're in human resources, if you're in customer experience, those jobs are open to you today. So really, it's not to think about, I would separate myself from all of the news and that sort of stuff. I've worked a little bit in television, a little bit in media. Understand that the whole focus of news is to make sure that it's an attention economy. It's to get your attention. The best way to get your attention is to create this relationship and tension between a sense of danger and a sense of urgency. So I would not spend too much time taking that in. I would spend the time thinking, okay, what are the risks to me? How do I mitigate those risks? And how do I really drill down on the opportunity? The first time that I saw this, I pulled my son out of school for 2 days. My son's 13. I pulled him out of school for 2 days and I said, you're going to spend a day looking at this. He did an entire project to try and figure out what are the tools that I can use? How can I use those tools? He has no interest in any of this stuff at 13, but I recognize that this is that important that you should spend some time. So I would tell people, spend some time thinking about it, spend some time mitigating the risk. The other opportunity that I would think about is what powers ChatGPT? What powers it, right? So, when I was in...
What is the data? Where's the sources of the data? And
right,
who's administering it? Who owns it? How much is it
who owns
worth?
the plumbing?
Exactly. How much is it worth? Yeah.
Right, who owns the plumbing? The internet, for example, is a large portion of the internet is owned by a company called Akamani. And I didn't know that. I have a cousin that works there, and I realized that all these cables under the ground where the internet is moving is owned by Akamani. In terms of powering AI and powering the industrial metaverse, is a company called NVIDIA. So OpenAI, which is the company that created ChatGPT, they use NVIDIA GPU cards. And one GPU card cost anywhere between $10,000 and $15,000. OpenAI, they need about 20,000 to 30,000 GPU cards based on ChatGPT 3, not four for a company. So you can imagine that every large company, the Bloombergs, the Googles, the Apples, they eventually will all start to have to get this plumbing. And at the new cards are worth $30,000 a card. If large companies are going to use 20,000 to 30,000 cards at a time, we're looking at purchase orders at $200-300 million at a time. So, I would, if I'm not the person to give financial advice, but I would pay a lot of attention to NVIDIA, because they sit as the plumbing. They sit as the plumbing for the AI revolution, and I would spend some time looking at them and looking at to see how their stocks are doing and looking at all the news that I could find on them.
Very interesting. And I did drop these companies in the chat for anybody that wants to do some research on the side of their desk while or after this conversation is taking place, because Dwayne always has the plugs and the drops. So you mentioned a lot on the employment opportunities and there being a huge employment gap around this. You've spoken about sort of the business opportunities. You've spoken about investment, which we just kind of touched on. I want to kind of dive into sort of the ethics, right? And intellectual property. We're seeing a lot of people having conversations about artists, and we know that we are, many people in the Black communities, diverse Black communities are a part of these communities of artists, creators, cultural curators, right? And so how does this implicate sort of the work that they do, the work that they're already trying to fight, lobby, advocate for, and what are some of the IP considerations that we need to think about?
So I think, probably one of the things that I saw that was really arresting for me, was somebody created a song with Drake and The Weeknd. And Drake never wrote a verse, The Weeknd never wrote a verse, and it was like, it sounded like Drake and The Weeknd in their style, and somebody had put this song together in a matter of hours, and that was quite profound. So I think one of the big things that's going to happen is artists are really going to have to think about how do they identify what's theirs and what's not, and how do they leverage their reach and scope in new models. And I don't know what those models are, but I do know at the beginning of streaming, there was a lot of concern about, the artist is no longer selling as many CDs. They're no longer selling as many CDs, and how will they make a living through streaming? And it turns out that most artists actually make more money through streaming than they were making when they were selling CDs, because the means of production shifted from a gatekeeper and gave them more access in terms of the means of distribution. And I believe that there is a model here, because one of the things that I find is that as people, no matter how many times things have become digital, we still lead with human first, right? We still lead with human first. Let me give you an example. The first time I heard a CD, music was absolutely perfect. Quality was perfect. Pressing was perfect, right? And up comes my favorite artist in concert, and it was $200. And there I am struggling to find my $200 to go sit somewhere in the nosebleeds to see a small dot that I believe that might be Jay-Z. And, just for me to see this concert and to be with everybody else and experience this. And if we look, we find this over and over again. We still find people going to see the theater, right? My son loves Hamilton. He went to see Hamilton live and loved the live version more than the perfectly pressed out Disney version that we looked at. All right. So I think that relationship between artist, person, and culture remains the same. My family is Trinidadian. I spent the first 12 years of my life in Trinidad, and I love Carnival almost as much as life itself. And, I'm going to see the concert, right? I'm going with my flag. I'm going to jump up, right? I'm waiting 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'm angry that the singer hasn't come out, and why won't they pay him? But I'm there every single time because I love that experience. And it doesn't matter how many times, I listen to it on YouTube. it actually drives me more because there's more access. So I believe that there's a model there. I don't know what it is, but I believe that there's a model there for artists. And I believe that the mindset needs to be, what was the gate that was blocking me before? And how does this open the gate? How does this open the gate that I now have more access to a wider audience of people? I don't know what that is, but I believe that there's an opportunity there, and I believe it's going to show itself, but the transition is going to be pretty uncomfortable.
Yeah, right. Like all revolutions, all, new trends, new generations face like these big, transformations. And personally, I think it could be really powerful and positive. And I'm choosing to see sort of through the lens that you are, where there's endless opportunities to explore. But, we always have to take into consideration the legacy of some of these, the legacy that we faced as a community, as a race. When innovation happens, right, we're usually left behind, or we're usually not part of the dialogue. And as you mentioned, there's gatekeeping that takes place that prevents us from kind of being at the forefront. So having conversations like these and dialogues that open it up, blow it open, demystify it, destigmatize it, and open our minds to how we can see ourselves in this are truly stimulating and important. So we have some great time on the clock left. I want to ask one more question, and I want to sort of see if we have any people that would like to also post a question for Dwayne to answer. But if you have anything kind of percolating in your mind so far, feel free to raise your hand and we'll go from there. But I do want to ask something in relation to education, because I know that's your specialty, and you're all over our TV screens always talking about the education and the education system and how technology interfaces to make learning better or worse. So I want to ask specifically, okay, in what ways can AI help to address some of the challenges facing the education system, such as student retention, achievement gaps, teacher shortages, and sort of in the context of education for multidisciplinary social workers, people who are in the space of educating others, whether you work for a consulting firm or you work in nursing or healthcare, you want to be able to share information and knowledge and pass it on to others. What does that sort of what does that process look like when we think about AI?
Sure. So, and there are a lot of things there, and I'll try to answer them on one big piece. When we started, before I mentioned a little bit about schools. So schools based on a Prussian model, right? And the Prussian model, Prussia doesn't exist anymore, but it was based on a Prussian model, and we scaled it up. And the way school was created, the form of it, was based on the limitation of the technology that was there and the source of the content, right? So remember, before the beginning, people were like, oh, we're concerned about misinformation. We all know now that a lot of the textbooks that we thought were true and gospel was not. There's a significant amount of misinformation. There are lots of stories that are missing from the conversation. A lot of the history that we've learned through the different Eurocentric formats, for example, are based on war and aggression, right? Like there's a significant, when you go through history is told from one war to the next. The 30-year war, 1,000-year war, World War I, World War II. There's lots of war, there's lots of violence and carnage, and in between there's the way that the story's weaved. But that's not necessarily the case for everybody in the world, right? And so there's a limitation to that technology. So today we start having the conversation saying, well, wait a minute, my story's not in there, right? My story's missing. I got a couple words on my story, but my story's actually not in there. And so, how do I do that? And then somebody puts up their hand and says, well, wait a minute, my story's not in there either. Right. So, now we're not talking about, okay, there's a Eurocentric version and there are, stories of the Black communities that are missing. where there are stories in the Muslim communities, and I say with an S, and the Black communities with an S that are missing, and the Persian communities and the Asian communities, and the different groups in Spain. And so we're like, well, how do we do that based on the model that we have? So the model of school is based on something like 30 to 40 to 1 in a room with one person. And you have a book. Now, the limitation to the book is that you can't travel with a lot of them. If you can't travel with a lot of books, you have to memorize as much as humanly possible, right, to be successful. You have 192 days, 6 hours a day, where you need to sit almost perfectly still and then try to memorize as much as humanly possible to get through the gate to go to the next, all to the promised land of post-secondary. Only 30% of the population will get to post-secondary. Only 30%. The highest post-secondary educated population in the world is Canada at 50%. So can you imagine, I know if I came home with a 50% to my mom when I was in Trinidad, it wouldn't be a good day, right? We have an entire system that, but the way that it judges itself is 50% is the highest success that we can get in terms of any country out of the 209, 210 countries in the world. So we recognize that it's not a problem with the teachers. It's a problem with the actual form factor of the system and the technologies that we use. The technology that we used at the time was the printed book. We supported it with the pencil from 1662, the pen from 1888, the blackboard from 1801, and we put the whole strategy together. How does AI help with that? Well, AI helps to personalize that story. It helps to personalize what's universal, what do I have to learn, and what is the content and context in which I need to learn it, right? So, I'll give you an example. We go to business school, they're business cases, all kinds of business cases. Well, let's look at the Caribbean. So in the Caribbean, I live in the city of Toronto. In the city of Toronto, probably about 50 years ago, maybe 60 years ago, a small group of people from the Caribbean came and they said, you know what, we need to have a little something, we'll call it Carnival. But we're here in Toronto, so we'll call it Caravana. So we start with this little thing, Caravana, pickup truck, a couple people jumping up and down behind a truck in the street. And it grows and it grows and it grows. And it's on University Avenue. And a gentleman comes along, and I know this gentleman actually quite well, and he says, you know what, it's too small for University Avenue, so I'm going to move it down to the lakeshore so it can grow to be bigger. So now it grows to be bigger, and it generates approximately $500 million in 10 days every year for the city of Toronto. So 6% of the population generates $500 million in a 10-day period. One of the largest, if not the largest, financial contributions of revenue to the city of Toronto and the province. Well, that's a business case, isn't it? We should really study that. People say, well, it doesn't really help our community. Well, I beg to differ. There are lots of people that have bought houses. There's lots of people that have started barbershops. There are lots of businesses that have started. We created an industry, and that industry was transplanted to many, many different cities around the world. So it's $1 billion industry where we've exported our culture and joy.
Right.
Not exploitation, joy. We've literally taken joy, we've packaged it, put it in different cities, and we've created $1 billion global industry. Somebody needs to tell that story, right? But that's an important story. It's an important story for my son to hear. It's an important story for your son to hear. And it's an important story for other people's communities to hear. It's important for the Italian community to hear. So, but with AI, we can now personalize that. We can now take that and we can spin that story together. We can turn that story into a writing assignment. We can turn it into videos. We can turn it into PowerPoints, and we can do all that. And we can do it for each individual kid through all the different classes. We need to understand the Italian community is what, 35% of the construction is the GDP of Canada. That's a vast majority of the Italian community. Well, that's important. I don't really necessarily see that in a textbook somewhere, right? But that's an important lesson. And so we can do that very, very quickly in a very personalized way with AI. The other is time, right? The other is time. Everybody has a shortage for time. Teachers require more time. Students require more time. With AI, we're able to give teachers back more time, and they can create opportunities for more bonding with kids. In terms of information, I don't like my teacher is okay, right? But now I have access to all these different tools where I can learn different things, even if I don't like my teacher, even if I don't think the teacher is treating me well. I can create learning agents that will support my learning just as well. So there are lots of opportunities, I think, for personalization and time. And, you know, really the key piece is when we think about AI, we should always think that it's human-led, purpose-driven, and technology augmented, not technology-led. When we have the technology lead, we run into problems. When we lead, we get better outcomes.
Snaps fingers to that one. Thank you so much for that incredible enriching, you know, piece of knowledge. I'm really like contextually, like it's crazy when you think about the things that we've created that we don't even document, that we don't necessarily know how to tell our stories because we're so kind of focused on the now and kind of just getting from point A to point B, that we have this legacy of misdocumenting or not documenting our stories at all. And then we're left with these like things where we can't transmit evidence of our experiences. We can't, you know, we have to speak anecdotally about things because they're not documented, right? And so that's a really interesting way of sharing the power of AI. I see my brother IBK with his hands up. IBK, feel free to hop on the mic.
Hi, Amoy. Good afternoon, everyone. Right. So just I'm not really sure where the conversation's at already. So I hope my question doesn't kind of take us like away from the thought process. But you know, I've heard a lot of people complain or starting to panic about the impact of AI on jobs. Right. Historically, I've heard that rhetoric over and over again. As technology evolves, people are always worried technology is going to take away the jobs, technology is going to do this or that. And so, you know, especially in the context of like Black people, I'm more curious to know what your thoughts are around how, and just flipping that script a little bit, how will AI create new jobs? Like, for example, and how would that evolution impact the Black community? A good example is a new role has come up now, which is like an AI prompt engineer that doesn't even require you to have a engineering background. You know, that's for me an evolution in, you know, the job space. And so I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are, and you know, especially around how it affect the Black community, and how the Black community can actually, instead of being afraid or worried about the impact of AI on jobs, how they can leverage this evolution to kind of position themselves for these new or potentially new roles that may pop up, if any at all.
So thank you very much for asking that question. And you know, we did touch on a bunch of it at the beginning, but I think it's important that we touch on it again. We talked about the prompt engineering. We talked about the fact that, you know, 21% of companies surveyed by Resume Builder said that they're going to hire prompt engineers at $200,000 plus a year, right? And as you mentioned, based on a field that really just emerged in November, right? So, you know, some companies that have over 1,000 people said that they will hire people at a starting salary of $300,000 a year. And this creates a massive opportunity for people in the Black community. The other that I will see is that a lot of the fear, there was a survey done, and I want to say, gosh, I'm trying to remember who did the survey. I can see the pictures now, but they looked at, you know, quote unquote, developed countries and quote unquote emerging economies and the feeling or sentiment around AI. And the Western countries had the most trepidation towards AI versus emerging countries around the world were actually quite excited about the possibility. And so, you know, if you're in the Black community, boy, this is a huge opportunity, I think. And so I agree with you. I think, you know, are things difficult now? 100%. But this may be one of the most exciting times for you know, kids like my son and my daughter. This is one of the most exciting times because every now and then you have these moments where everybody, including the gatekeeper, is not 100% sure what's happening, and it creates this opportunity. I don't want to use the term even playing field because that wouldn't be true, but it creates an opportunity where with the right type of mindset, you can really maximize these moments. So you mentioned prompt engineer. There are a lot of people that just want ChatGPT experience. There are people that are looking for AI. A lot of work that is remote. You know, we're doing a project with people in the Caribbean, and they're going to be able to do things in the Caribbean, right? Making North American money in the Caribbean, which is transformative. You know, we're doing a cyber project and in Barbados, and people will be making Canadian money in an island as small as Barbados. It will have a profound impact on them, a profound impact on the prosperity of their economy. And so there are opportunities like this, I think, all over. And I think it would be a shame if we were to miss this. But I agree with you. This is a great opportunity. And I think it is really a great way for us to shift the conversation into, you know, we spend a lot of time on defense, which we need. And by defense, I mean, you know, protecting the systemic racism, protecting to make sure that, you know, that people know about it, and protecting to make sure that people understand, you know, how we're challenged. But this is an opportunity also for offense, which is going out and securing economic wherewithal, increasing in one generation, you know, large sums of salary, large opportunities for business. I think this is a great time for that. So, you know, what we need to do is get as many people in our community as possible connected and with devices and connected to these types of platforms, because when we bring that different cultural nuance, there are lots of problems in our communities that we've solved that are global problems. Right? You know, I mentioned Caravana. I go, we've turned joy into a business. That's a global problem. We have mental health and people that are feeling sad. I go, that's a contribution to that problem. You know, Uber is really, in Trinidad, we call that pulling bull. Some people call it gypsy cab. That's a problem that we already solved. You know, there's emerging fintech out of Nigeria where people are solving problems around the way that money moves around the world in their communities, and now it's becoming, you know, something that can go out into the world. So there's lots of innovation that comes from our communities, and lots of problems that we've already solved, and having the right tools to go out and amplify those solutions. I think, you know, quite frankly, it's not altruism. The world needs it.
Wow, thank you for that. Brilliant, brilliant insights. IBK, I hope you're full with that answer because I'm full. I took so many notes. Sister Blessed Brooks, nice to see you again, Queen. Feel free to hop on the mic.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the whole conversation today, especially even the questions that came out, because I know those do pop up a lot. So I am from Sisters in Solidarity, the managing director. I just wanted to put it out there for anyone interested that we're in the process of building a database that will help to prompt engineers and developers in our community. So if anyone's interested, I'm now moving, so I'm going to ask my brother Vic if he could drop my email in the chat, bless@sissolidarity.ca. And I would love to connect with anyone who is interested in working on something like that with us.
That's fantastic.
That's amazing. That's a great way to mobilize the community and use data to kind of bring things forward, right, as usual. So very, very grateful. And thank you for sharing that, Victor. I'm sure we'll drop that information. Before we close out, because we do have 5 minutes left on our clock, does anybody have any other questions? I see Ryan on, I see Ma'at, Velshia, Tanisha, hello. Alicia, anybody has any burning questions that they really want to ask? Alicia, feel free to unmute.
Yeah, thanks so much for this great conversation. My one burning question around like how we manage the different risks around AI, especially when it comes to ethics, and we talk about the limitations of even that example you raised, Dwayne, of schools, you know, of what limited education we got, of the experience of residential schools for Indigenous folks. Like, what are some of the systemic or regulatory solutions that we should be thinking about, or that you wish we were thinking about now to manage those risks?
I think, one of my concerns with some of the risks, and I'll go with concerns. One of my concerns is speed. We typically have a very slow process when it comes to responding. I think probably one of the slowest responses we've had, which is something that I think is probably as profoundly as dangerous as social media. I think we were very slow to respond to social media. We were very slow to respond to, how can it be leveraged for positive versus negative? So I think the key piece for me will be speed. And the best way to think about speed is not to look at the implications from a tactical point of view, but to look at it from a strategic point of view. And what do I mean by that? I mean, we need to, if for example, let's use school as an example, right? When we think about school, if I ask most people what's school for, they'll say it's to teach kids how to read. Well, actually, school is to prepare students to be contributing members of society, because you can learn how to read at home. You can learn math at home, and particularly now you can do it, right? But to be an actual contributing member of society, you need some kind of formalized schooling to drive community forward. So I think keeping our eyes on the North Star and looking at technology as a tool and thinking AI, computer, algorithm, book is a hammer and a screwdriver. So thinking, what do we need the tools to do, right? What are the outcomes that we're interested in? And I think once we understand what those outcomes are, what are we interested in a big way, we'll be able to then think about what kind of tools do we go out and use, and when do we use the tools, and when we don't use the tools. I'll give you a really quick example. There are no more Ford Focuses being built in Canada. Most small cars aren't being built. Most of the small cars that were built were designed specifically for 16-year-old kids just getting young and saying, you know what, I want to jump in and have my first car. And so why did they do that? They did that because they wanted to create very shallow relationships with lots of different people. Today, we find that kids aren't getting their driver's license as much, and we don't have any of these cars because the phone allows us to create those shallow relationships, as a matter of fact, much more efficiently than it would take for somebody to drive the car around. So the common north, or the purpose of those young people, was to make those connections, not necessarily to have a car. The car just got that job done. So I want us to think about what job are we trying to get done, and then we can think about what tools do we need to go use. So if the idea is, we want to learn more about different groups and their history, then what tools do we need to go get those? Can we take the AI and can we take it through all of the different pieces of information? Can we contextualize it into a box and we say, okay, this is where you go. It's not Chat GPT across the web, but it may be all the 630 different groups coming and saying, these are the stories that we put, and now people can find out about us through these specific stories. I don't know, but I think the idea of what job are we trying to get done at the big, high strategic level will really help to inform what kinds of policies we put in place, as opposed to knee-jerk responses that are on the tactical level and not necessarily the strategic level.
Brilliant way to answer that one. Gems drop. I hope everyone's taking notes. That's, as Alicia mentioned, an amazing way to frame it. Ma'at, we have our last question from Ma'at, and then I will close out the night.
Hey, Amoy, how are you? Hope everyone's doing good. This is great. I even put a note in, I said, I'm like overdosing on AI because it's one thing I like to, I'm a, investigator. I like to see what's new, what's going on. So really quick, I had a more detailed question, but we're coming to the end of the hour. What would be a good website to be up on the latest and also being aware of, the things that are coming out that could be dangerous, like people taking our voice, using it, calling mom and dad for ransom. So we know that these things are happening in the AI world. Is there a website that we can go on to keep ourselves updated on the new technology, the new AIs, as well as the dangers, the positives and the negatives? Thank you so much.
Okay, so you're it's interesting. You're looking for the secret sauce. Now, so here's the secret sauce. There's a great website called Futurepedia. It's either .ai or .io, Futurepedia. And these curators, they curate the latest and they check on the different AI companies that are coming out. So far, when I found them, they had 25 companies on the list. They now have over 2,200 companies on the list. And there is, and I will send to Moy, there is an email that I follow where this person looks at, he breaks it down into like three, very manageable areas. A, some of the latest news, B, a couple of the latest prompts, and then C, a couple of interesting companies. But he also looks at risks and not. And if you follow me on LinkedIn, I'm on LinkedIn. I repost a bunch of things. I actually am quite prolific on LinkedIn. I write probably about 500 words or so every morning before I start my day. And in there, sometimes I will put links back to different leaders that are looking at some of the big challenges. Like right now, Professor Jeffrey Hinton, who is the godfather of machine learning and artificial intelligence at the University of Toronto, was working at Google DeepMind for about 10 years, and he resigned this morning because he says he'd like to talk more about the risks and doesn't want to do that from inside of a company. He's decided he's made enough money in his life, and so now he wants to talk about what are some of the actual risks that we face, and some of the risks are a little bit more existential than we talked about, right? Like we have large language models that are mimicking human interaction from mathematical probability. These lead to big existential problems. And so, there's some things that are like that. And then there's a vast majority of people that are not going to be well trained or well equipped to be able to deal with the types or volume of misinformation that we can now pump out. Like we've seen the impact of misinformation. Back in 2000, I want to say 2010, someone came to me and showed me a technology called sentiment analysis and how it would be used to sway elections. And so, we saw it used in the Obama election. And, a lot of people, if they were Obama fans, were like, well, that wasn't so bad. We wanted Obama to win. Then we saw it used in the Trump election. And then a lot of people thought, gosh, that is something. And so we start to realize that there are some nefarious actors that have complete teams of people that you can hire that pump massive amounts of information just right into social media, into Twitter, into all these different places to confuse, maybe not necessarily to have you believe one thing or another, but to have you be, in disbelief of everything, which is enough. And so I think that's one of the things that I think the one big place that I would like to see a big change as well is in education. I would love to see us move more to ethics, first principle thinking, and critical thinking, first principle thinking specifically, and mental frameworks, where we start to teach kids at the very, very core basics how to think and how to break and distill things down to its very first principles, as opposed to just adopting and taking in the stories of people around them, because that leaves them vulnerable, even if it's a story that we like. So I think those are things that I think that are really critical. But Futurepedia, there's the email is Zane. You can follow me on LinkedIn, and then in terms of first principle thinking, if you have children, I would get them thinking about first principles thinking tonight.
There you have it, everyone. First principle thinking. That is a very, very good concept. I'm sure you'll talk a bit more too. Everyone, we've posted tons of different links that you can use as a resource. I just want to say thank you for joining. We want to end this session the way we began, by acknowledging the original stewards of the various lands we are on. We also acknowledge our ancestors. We acknowledge all of those who toiled without compassion or compensation, and we acknowledge all the elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. Thank you for joining, and wish you guys all the best.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for joining us, Dwayne. You're the best.
Thank you.